Thank you, Pastor Phillips, or should I call you Jeffrey?
Jeffrey's fine.
Okay. And I'm really honored to be invited to this gathering of the Spiritual Enrichment Ministry. What I wanted to do today is I wanted to introduce the Talmud, about which I wrote a book, and to eventually lead up to teaching from the Talmud that I think would be kind of seasonal, timely in light of the Jewish calendar because of the upcoming Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and also hopefully we'll speak to the theme of seeing things in the eyes of others. So I wanted to start by introducing you to the Talmud, because I doubt any of you know much about the Talmud before we start. If any of you studied Talmud, I don't want to assume too much, but so I need to give you just in a nutshell what the Talmud is, a basic overview introduction before I can start saying things about it. So the Talmud is Jewish scripture. And I like to make the provocative claim that the Talmud is the most important book in the Jewish canon. Usually my audience will be up in arms about that, because obviously the Bible should be the most important book in the Jewish canon. The reason why I think the Talmud is the most important book in the Jewish canon is because while the Bible is still central to Jewish ritual practice, and the Bible is still foundational in the sense of Judaism's understanding that it is direct communication from God, indirectly produced by various writers, the Bible's meaning has been replaced or supplemented by interpretations, many of which are found in the Talmud. So just to back up for a second, the Hebrew Bible, which you may know more usually as the Old Testament, those two terms are roughly the same. The Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are pretty much the same. The Hebrew Bible was the last book of the Hebrew Bible from a historical perspective, not in terms of the order that we find the books presented, but the last book to be written and included in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Daniel, which was written around the 2nd century BCE. The 160s BCE. We know that the book of Daniel was written in the 160s BCE because it describes allegorically the fight that is commemorated in the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, the fight between a small band of rebellious Jews and the Syrian Greek king Antiochus IV. It was a very unusual battle, that battle, and most his people who were contemporaneous thought that the small band of Maccabees would lose to the much larger and better organized and funded Greek army, which is why the book of Daniel prophesies that they will lose. But historically, they didn't lose, they won. And so that's how we know that the book of Daniel was written during that conflict, because the sections of it describe things that we know to have historically happened, and sections of it describe things that it claims are going to happen that never did happen. So because the prophecy kind of gets it wrong, we can date it from that. But anyway, that's the 2nd century BCE is when the final book that is included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible is written. And during the Second Temple period, let me go back a second. Judaism can be thought of as a covenantal religion. Going back to Abraham, there's a contract between the people and God where there's an agreement. If you do what's good, God rewards you. If you do what's bad, God punishes you. And we've probably been accustomed to hearing about Old Testament God being very much on the punishing side of things. But that's because it's very much a covenantal way of thinking about religiosity. Well, if you look at your Old Testament Hebrew Bible carefully, at the beginning, God speaks to people like a regular character. So when Adam and Eve talk to God, they're a little afraid of God, but they have regular conversations. Abraham has conversations with God. And as you move forward in the history of the Hebrew Bible, eventually it's just Moses. God tries to speak to all the people at Mount Sinai, but it's too overwhelming. They say, speak to Moses, because we can't handle it. And then God starts speaking just to Moses. And from that point on, you get the figure of the prophet. And so from within the history of the Hebrew Bible, from what the Bible claims around 1200 BCE until around 600 BCE, the word of God appears to the people in the form of prophecy. Specific, charismatically selected people, the most famous ones are Elijah and Elisha, have the message of God flow through them. And we get various books of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, that take the form of first-person poetic speeches that are said by these special people, the prophets. Then the first temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BCE, and a strange thing happens. When the Judeans come back from Babylonia and they start to put their religious life and the center of Jerusalem back together again, there's not really prophecy anymore. Ezekiel had been a prophet in Babylonia. Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel actually takes place in Babylonia. And then in the first century after the return to Judea, you get some of the minor prophets that are still in the Hebrew Bible. But then around 450 BCE, no more prophecy. It's hard to understand why that would be, like why all of a sudden there's no more prophets. But what's curious is throughout the surrounding areas, in Assyria and Babylonia and Persia, you see kind of the same thing. There were prophets in those cultures, and now as of 450 BCE, there's no more prophets. So somehow, the cultural expectation that prophecy was the way that people speak to God is replaced. So what's it replaced by? So beginning in 450 BCE, it's kind of replaced by a notion of books and text as the vehicles for getting the message of God. So we don't really think about this much, but we think of the Bible as a book. You know, we open up the hotel drawer and the Gideon family has sponsored a Bible that's sitting there and it comes bound in a book and it's the Old Testament and the New Testament. But the technology for producing all of that text in a single book didn't exist till 5th or 6th century CE. The way books were transmitted until the 3rd century CE was in the form of scrolls, kind of like if you would go to a synagogue and you'd see a Torah scroll. It's written on parchment paper. It's on parchment, which is the hide of an animal that's been flattened out, and it's attached to rollers, so you can roll it. It's a very inefficient way of producing books. It's inefficient because parchment only allows you to write on one side and not the other. There's a rough side and a smooth side. It's inefficient because parchment's really heavy. So if you start having a long piece of parchment, it becomes very difficult to lift. It's inefficient because you can't flip from the beginning to the end very easily. You got to roll the whole thing. When I say the Hebrew Bible, what I'm really talking about is I'm actually talking about what would have been a library of scrolls. Even the 5 books of Moses, which we think of as one scroll, were usually not written in a single scroll in the ancient world. The Genesis would have been its own scroll. And then you would have had a bookcase or some kind of collection where you would collect all of these scrolls. Well, now that you have that notion of a library or bookshelf, it might make more sense to understand that during the Second Temple period, there were a lot of different people writing books. And the people who probably would have been prophets 100 years before are now writers. And what they're seeing that things are becoming more canonical. That is, they're more included in everybody's library. And so people start thinking, well, how do I get my work included in this library? How do I make sure that my book is also treated very valuably? So they start doing interesting things. One of the interesting things is something called Suitabieography. Is anyone familiar with Suitabieography? Yeah,
I just passed up a book yesterday on the subject of the Suitabieography of a first century Jewish prophet, not like a theologian, but a compiler of texts from and explainer of the Old Testament, like the Midrash.
Midrash, yeah. So pseudepigraphy is the act of writing under the assumed name of a real person who lived in the past and is already considered authoritative. Right? So it's as if Mark Twain hadn't chosen Mark Twain, but had chosen Jesus as his name, right? Like, you write under a pen name, but the pen name is the name of a real person who lived in the past and is authoritative. So during the Second Temple period, we've got books written by Moses, written by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the tribes of all the sons of Jacob. Four different people decided to write as Enoch. Who's Enoch? Well, the book of Genesis includes Enoch in a list of names and says Enoch was taken by God directly up into heaven. So that's a great person to write as. You don't have a lot of limiting data. You don't have to really restrict yourself. And you have a lot of access to really important information. So 4 different people had the idea of writing as Enoch, right? So basically we have all kinds. Curiously, we don't have a lot of pseudepigraphy with female names because probably most of the writers were men. And the idea of writing as Sarah didn't occur to them. But in terms of the men's names from the Hebrew Bible, we pretty much have everything. Like, think of an important name from the Hebrew Bible that's a male name, and we have a book from the Second Temple period where someone was writing that. Anyway, so this was the practice. That was one thing that they started to do. The other thing they started to do was something called the rewritten Bible. Rewritten Bible is exactly like it sounds. If you want to be part of the library, you take something that's already in the library and you revise it. So there was a book called the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees only survives to the present day, through 2 avenues. Until 50 years ago, the only way we knew about the Book of Jubilees was because the Ethiopic church had preserved this book in Ethiopic, and that was how the rest of the world knew that this book existed. And basically, this book is a retelling of the Bible beginning at Genesis, and it goes from the creation of the world at Genesis 1 through to the giving of the 10 Commandments in the middle of Exodus, and then it stops. And why would an author write it? Well, the author clearly has an agenda. One of the things the author does is whenever one of the patriarchs or matriarchs does something that's a little problematic, they change the story slightly. So when Abraham and Sarah are visited by 3, are they men, are they angels? Really not clear from the original text. There's some kind of emissaries from God. And these people tell them that Isaac is going to be born, even though Sarah is 90 and Abraham is 100. They make a meal. And the meal that they serve involves meat and milk together, which is a violation of kosher law. So Abraham and Sarah are not keeping kosher in their desert tent, which is not historically a problem because the kosher laws hadn't existed yet. But for the writer of Jubilees, this was a problem. How could one of the patriarchs be serving non-kosher to a group of angels? So they changed the menu. And suddenly Abraham and Sarah are not serving those same food items, right? Because now, these are the kinds of things. So not every book that was written during the Second Temple period ends up in the canons of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Many of them are excluded. You may know some of them are excluded because in various church traditions they get included as apocrypha. So they're kind of in the Bible but outside the Bible. So now you may have a better understanding of where these apocrypha are coming. They're books that kind of got included for some people's libraries but not others. And that's why they have this kind of status of being half in and half out of your canon. The Apocrypha are not in the Jewish canon, so they're not in the Hebrew Bible, but some of them are in the Old Testament because where does the Old Testament come from? The Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which was done by Egyptian Jews beginning in the 3rd century BCE, does include many of the Apocrypha. So even like the books of the Maccabees, which tell the story of the Hanukkah story that happened in the 2nd century BCE, they're in the Old Testament because it's based on the Greek translation that the Egyptian Jews did. They're not in the Hebrew Bible, which is based on what the rabbis in Palestine decided they wanted to include in their Bible. So there's just a little bit of difference, but I digress. We're getting to the Talmud. We then see that from this period of writing, at some point, just like prophecy stopped, writing stopped. At some point, around the 2nd century BCE, it became understood that you weren't allowed to produce books in the same way anymore. Like original books that were going to be included in this library and have the same authority. And we don't really know why these changes happen. Like why culturally is it not acceptable? But what comes to replace the writing of new books is the interpretation of books. So what we see in and around what's now Israel during the 1st century BCE is the rise among the religious elites of religious sects. And the sects are rising around biblical interpretation. So what we're getting now is increasing literacy among the elite population. And it used to be that literacy was reserved for professional scribes, who were the only ones who could read and write. But now, basically, if you're wealthy enough, you get educated and you become literate, you become capable of reading. And as there become a group of mostly men who are literate and have the means to spend their day studying religion, they dedicate their time to interpreting the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And then they start disagreeing with each other. Some of the most profound disagreements were about the calendar. Why is the calendar so crucial to the formation of different sects? Why would a calendar difference cause different communities to splinter into competing churches or communities? If your calendar is not the same, then your holidays are not the same. Right? So if you think about the Eastern Orthodox Christmas versus the Christmas that's typically celebrated by Western churches, they're like 2 or 3 weeks off from each other. So you can't be in the same church if you're celebrating your holidays on different days. So in the 1st century, there's a lot of debate about texts and interpretation and also the calendar. So you have some sects that are going with a lunar calendar because the Hebrew Bible seems to advocate a lunar calendar. And you have some sects that are going with a solar calendar. Now, a lunar calendar is 354 days. A solar calendar we know to be 365 and a quarter days. Back then, there were people who thought it was 365 days. They didn't account for the quarter. And there were people who thought it should be 364 days. And then there were people who rounded down to the easier number of 360. So the different sects disagreed by a few days. And those few days are enough to make a big difference. One such sect pulled itself out of the mainstream community in Jerusalem, where the temple was and where sacrifices were offered, and withdrew to the caves of the Dead Sea, where they lived for over a century in the desert as a separate, probably monastic community, collecting their own books, which they preserved in earthenware jugs. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd came across these books and discovered what's now called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls is a library full of about 1,000 books. Most of them, not all of them are in complete shape, so I say 1,000. They're pieces of 1,000 books. But they really give us a good impression of what sectarian life was like. We have books there from the Bible, we have books there from the Apocrypha, and we have books there that we've never heard of before. The Book of Jubilees was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we had this Ethiopic version of the Book of Jubilees, and then in the 1940s they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they find the original Hebrew version of it. And luckily it was the full scroll, so they actually have the full version, Hebrew version of the Book of Jubilees. A tremendous find. But it also gives us insight into just how much textual production there was. A lot of textual production. And it seems like the Dead Sea Scrolls people, they would spend half of their time studying the old books, and half of their time producing a kind of new book, but it wasn't in the same library. It's kind of a new book. It was a code of living. So they produced something called the Community Rule, which is the rules of how to live this kind of monastic life. And it wasn't just all about like who's supposed to take out the garbage. It was also supposed to be about like ethics and how to treat one another with kindness, respectfully. And it seems like there's a connection between, all the way going back, between that kind of rule book that they were producing and going all the way back to Hammurabi's Code. So Hammurabi's Code was produced in the 18th century BCE. And it's a code of law, but unlike our codes of law, it doesn't seem to have ever been used in a courtroom to adjudicate a dispute between people. it was produced by a group of scholars who thought that the law was a productive way of thinking about the right way of being in the world. And actually, there's a whole tradition of ancient Near Eastern law going back to the 27th century BCE of these kinds of codes of law. And so one way of thinking about the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually it's just a continuation of that kind of scholastic line. And the Bible itself, the Old Testament, has embedded within it codes of law that also probably were never enacted as real laws, but they tell you about what the ethics are. Like if you see someone, the Bible famously the examples of the Bible civil law, if you see someone broken down on the side of the road and their animal is suffering, you have to stop and help them and unburden them, right? There are all kinds of like ethical things in the Bible that are embedded within these law codes that are also all about like damages. Like if you do this, if you dig a pit and someone falls into it, you owe them a certain amount of damages, right? So this is a way of thinking ethically was through these law codes. So we know in the Second Temple period, the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrates that the sects were doing this kind of thinking, but they were doing this kind of thinking separate from one another. We know of at least 10 sects that existed during the 1st century CE. So now I'm moving even forward, 1st century CE, at least 10 sects. 3 of them very prominent, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. We think that the Qumran community were the Essenes. But alongside these sects, you also have the rise of early Christianity. So in the 30s CE, after the death of Jesus, you have a group of people who have elevated Jesus to think of Jesus as a messianic figure. And Paul switches from being a Pharisee, a member of one sect, to being an early Christian, and he sort of adopts early Christianity. And then you get early Christianity is really a sect alongside these other sects. And all of this is going along until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Creates a major crisis. Because Judaism, even though these sects were fighting over the calendar and they were fighting over how to interpret different home rituals and things like that, they had somewhat of an agreement that everything was centered on the temple in Jerusalem. And for most Jews, the only way of really being religious, there was no synagogues outside. The only way of really being religious was you would come and bring a sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. And now that wasn't available. So what ends up happening for both Christianity and Judaism is a kind of reinvention or a magnification of some of the energy that existed beforehand. So some of the sectarian energy, if you want to understand where both Judaism and Christianity really come from, the destruction of the temple creates a crisis. It's no accident that the temple's destroyed in 70, and suddenly the Gospels are written in the 80s. The Synoptic Gospels are written in 84, 85, 89, 90. And part of what they're doing is they're promoting this idea that somehow Jesus is a replacement for the temple. And that's replacement for sacrifices. There's a lot going on there. Meanwhile, among what would later become the rabbinic Jews, you get a similar thing. There's a crisis happening, and now these various sects can't splinter anymore because they're not unified anymore. So what you see starting to happen is they coalesce into a single group, the rabbis. So you can't really talk about the rabbis before the destruction of the temple. They didn't really exist. But to some extent, the rabbis are a continuation of the Pharisees, the Pharisaic sect. Certainly biologically, some of the rabbis had grandfathers who were Pharisees, and they kind of continue that. And so they inherit from the Pharisees a dedication to scholastic life, and a dedication to 2 types of study. They study the Bible very closely, and then they also create law codes. This is kind of what they inherit from the sectarian life. So they study the Bible, and they study their studies of the Bible become increasingly creative, and the term midrash is used to describe the rabbinic capacity for interpreting the Bible in really radically interesting ways. Basically, the rabbis do not feel bound to a contextual interpretation. They don't need to explain the verses of the Bible based on what they mean in the context of their passages. They license themselves to pull the verse out and really take it apart linguistically and do all kinds of creative things with it. One of the creative things that they allow themselves to do is they allow themselves to read completely across the canon. So if you're confused about a verse in one part of the Bible, you can answer it by reading elsewhere in the Bible. My favorite example of this is the Jewish holiday of Sukkot is coming up in a week and a half, and Jews still follow the practice of bringing certain ritual fruits. It's very similar to Palm Sunday. The Bible says on this day you bring a number of different species of agriculture. So one of the things you're supposed to bring, the Bible says, is Peri Eitz Hadar, fruit, tree, beautiful. So I was once a mathematician in an earlier life, so I really enjoy the ambiguity of Peri Eitz Hadar, of fruit, tree, beautiful, because mathematically, the word beautiful can either be defining the fruit, or the tree, or the fruit and the tree, depending on how you have your parentheses, right? So it's either the fruit of a beautiful tree, or the beautiful fruit of a tree, or the beautiful fruit of a beautiful tree. All of those would be acceptable interpretations of the Bible, and all of those would be the kinds of things that first century BCE sects would have debated. But even if you've gotten past those ambiguities, the mathematical ambiguities, then you're faced with linguistic ones. Like, beautiful? Everything's beautiful. Like, beauty is completely subjective. What's not a beautiful tree? I don't know that I've ever seen a non-beautiful tree or a non-beautiful fruit. I mean, I've seen really exotic fruits, but they're beautiful in their own ways. So if you're a rabbinic Jew, one of the ways you answer this question is you do Midrashic interpretation, which means you're jumping off from one verse in Leviticus to other places where you might find the answer. So you might find the answer in the book of Genesis. Adam and Eve are in the garden, and they're encountering a fruit, a tree, and a beautiful. Great. However, if you've read Genesis, you may realize that the fruit is never identified in Genesis. So expanding it to Genesis has now doubled my problem. So then the rabbis will be, okay, well, where else in the Bible? Oh, the Song of Songs. In the book of in this last section of the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Songs, a book of love poetry, talks about two lovers who are having a relationship under an apple tree. Okay, so now the Garden of Eden must have been talking about an apple, and the fruit from the holiday of Sukkot must be an apple. But I guarantee you, when you're walking the streets of wherever you can see Jews walking to synagogue, you're not going to see anyone holding an apple. Because that's not the tradition. The tradition is a citron, which is why in rabbinic Midrash you will find a view by a rabbi from the 2nd century CE that Adam and Eve ate one of these bitter citrons in the garden. Because they're reading across the canon, only they don't conclude that the solution is that they're all apples. They conclude that the solution is that they're all citrons. These like lemon, like very bitter. Of course, it's a very different story if Eve is given this fruit by the serpent and it turns out to be this bitter citron and she eats it and she's very happy. I don't know why she would be so happy. Doesn't taste very good. But this is one of the things the rabbis do. They do Midrash, which allows them to creatively read across the canon. And then they do something called Mishnah. Mishnah is basically that law code form of organization. And it ends up being kind of like a right brain, left brain relationship, where Midrash is the way they create new things in the world. They can't write brand new books. They can't generate new communication from God like the prophets did. But they can get their text to speak to their present day realities through interpretation. And they've licensed themselves to very creatively interpret out of context. And so they're basically pulling verses from the Bible and reading them almost allegorically. The early Christians went really allegorical. And they connected with the ancient Greeks who really liked to read allegorically. The Jews didn't want to read allegorically, so they created this kind of midrash where they weren't. With an allegory, you can take something and make it a metaphor, and then it becomes about something else, and it's completely unconnected in context. What the rabbis did was they connected it. They anchored it by reading one thing in light of something else. And because it was anchored elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, somehow this made it kosher, like the reading was okay. And through this way, they developed all kinds of new ways of thinking about their tradition, and they had to, because there was no temple anymore. So they invented all kinds of new ways, new rituals around the home, rituals around the synagogue. They invented a whole prayer corpus that didn't exist. These things were substitutes for sacrifice. They invented all kinds of things. And over the course of basically 500 years, between the 2nd century CE and the 8th century CE, they reinvent Judaism. And so the Judaism you now know in the world, whatever brand of Judaism you've seen, is basically on the basis of the rabbinic revolution. And the rabbinic revolution it basically started with these two types of literature. There was a Mishnah kind of literature that they were producing, the codes, and then there was the Midrashic kind of literature where they were creatively reading the Bible. But in the year 200 was when a rabbi named Rabbi Judah the Prince. Oh, I should add one more thing. They believed very strongly that the age of writing was over. So I mentioned you can't write new books, which meant that all of their interpretation of the Bible had to be done orally. So unlike the Dead Sea Scroll community, which was actually writing down its interpretations, when the rabbis post-temple started producing their own literature, the Midrash and the Mishnah, they produced it all orally. If you saw the size of these things, you would be shocked, because they're massive, but all oral. So what survives to the present day from this period is about 35 works of Midrash, of creative interpretation of the Bible, all memorized for hundreds of years before they were finally written down. Similarly, we have in the present 2 works of Mishnah. The works of Mishnah that we have, so in the year, around the year 200, Rabbi Judah the Prince organized something called the Mishnah. It was his definitive collection of all of the oral compilations out there. He organized all of the thoughts, and he organized them in a very orderly way. So he created 6 topical orders. So the first order deals with agricultural laws, and the second order deals with things related to the calendar, and the third one deals with family law, and then the fourth one deals with civil and criminal law, and then you get the fifth one deals with temple-related law, and the sixth one deals with the laws of purity and impurity. So these are very well ordered, and then within each order, there are tractates. Some orders have 7, some orders have 14, but they're very orderly tractates by topic. So in the order of the calendar, you get, like, every Jewish holiday gets a tractate. And then within the tractates are divided in an orderly fashion into chapters. So for example, if I wanted to know what fruit you take on the holiday of Sukkot, you go to the order of the calendar, you go to the tractate of the holiday of Sukkot, you go to the chapter that deals with the 4 species, and there you find a Mishnah which tells you it's supposed to be a citron. One of the things that happened, though, was when Rabbi Judah the Prince was doing this compilation of all these oral traditions that were out there, because there were lots of different rabbis producing these things orally, he decided, probably for efficiency's sake, not to choose among them, but to record their opinions within the law code as competing versions. So it could be that, like it said, you should bring a citron on the holiday, but Rabbi so-and-so said you could bring an apple, right? So this is a hypothetical example. It doesn't really exist. But this is really what the Mishnah, produced by Rabbi Judah the Prince, what it looks like. It's this very bizarre law code. Imagine if your driving manual said that you could make a right turn on red, but then the mayor says you can't make a right turn on red. And then you have a sense of what the Mishnah is like. It's that kind of like... But if you understand that the reason for the law code is not to actually enforce a law and punish people for violating it, but to kind of organize your thoughts, it makes a little bit more sense. But over time, the rabbis who were... the production of this Mishnah actually led to a reinvention of the curriculum. Once they had this extremely orderly presentation of the entire religion, they decided, well, it didn't make sense anymore to split half their time with random thoughts on the Bible and half their time organizing those thoughts. They could just take that organizational structure that Rabbi Judah the Prince created and spend their entire time unpacking it. The conversation unpacking that organized thing was called Talmud. So the act of having a conversation around that orderly Mishnah was Talmud. And to some extent, the Talmud conversation kind of undoes some of the orderly work of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is beautifully organized, and the Talmud kind of recreates the chaos of the Midrash by doing a kind of Midrashic reading to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was able to pull the Bible out of context and start reading in all kinds of creative ways. The Talmud does the same thing to the Mishnah. So most passages of the Talmud will start with a Mishnah. Now, in the Mishnah, in the interest of efficiency and order and organization, Rabbi Judah the Prince basically gives you the rules of Judaism. Here's what you have to do. You say this prayer at this time. He doesn't say why, so he doesn't give you a rationale, and he doesn't connect it to the Bible, even though all these things were at one point connected to the Bible. But in the interest of organization, he tries to keep things very tight. What do the rabbis who produce the Talmuds do? They come along and they start conversations around the Mishnah, and their first question is always, how do we know this? great, you're telling me that I have to say this prayer at this time of day. Why? And then the answer to that is usually a midrashic reading of the Bible. And so, like, a Talmudic passage is usually starts with a Mishnah and its law, and then it'll be someone will ask the question, how do we know this? And then there'll be a midrash. But what's fascinating about the Talmud is the Talmud was actually originally a set of conversations conducted in two different geographic locations, one in Palestine and one in Babylonia. So Palestine, present-day Israel, Babylonia, present-day Iraq. For several generations, the oral Mishnah was debated and discussed by a group of rabbis who would organize their own thoughts orally. This would eventually, after 4 generations, the Palestinian conversation comes to an end and becomes organized as the Palestinian Talmud. After 7 generations, the rabbinic conversations that were happening in modern-day Iraq came to an end and were organized and produced as the Babylonian Talmud. Because they went on for several more generations, and because they imported most of the material from Palestine ends up imported by the Babylonians into their conversation, the Babylonian Talmud is like 3 times the size of the Palestinian Talmud. It's much better written. It's better organized. It's not better organized, but it has enough signposts that if you're capable in Aramaic, you have a shot at understanding what it means, which the Palestinian Talmud is much more complicated. And so that's why my book, The Talmud, is about the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, which was complete around the year 800 or so, would become the elite textbook of Judaism. Since the year 800, anyone who's aspired to a leadership position within the Jewish community has had to become an expert in this text. Becoming an expert in the Talmud is not easy, because the Talmud is written in this very messy way. It's written in a hybrid language of Hebrew and Aramaic. It assumes that you already know the Bible, right? So if you're reading it and you're coming to it and you don't know the Bible, it's very confusing. And then on top of that, starting in 800, there began to develop commentaries. Commentaries and commentaries and commentaries and commentaries. Because it was the elite document. And so you get lots of arguments about the interpretation of this text. But the precedent of the rabbis themselves was already established. And that precedent was no more splintering into different communities. No more splintering into debates about what the religion means. We are now going to be tolerant of one another and pluralistic. And in fact, in the Talmud itself, there are really fascinating stories about the rabbis kind of having arguments with God. There's no more prophecy anymore, so these are all like supernatural stories where they encounter God and they have conversations about the notion of divine truth. And they come to the conclusion that even God, by the end of the rabbinic period, understands that God can have an idea and that in some ways is metaphysical truth. But the rabbis don't have to follow it because there can be multiple religious truths. They reach a conclusion that God has accepted that human beings are responsible for producing religious ideas, and that if they produce religious ideas that disagree with God's, those are equally authoritative. So it's kind of a radical theology that is produced by the end of the rabbinic period, and it creates a really nice opportunity for there to be pluralism within Judaism, which is why you see to this day, even though Judaism in modernity splintered back into denominations, it did splinter back into denominations. Now you have Reform Judaism, and Reconstructionist, and Orthodox and Conservative, different. But they still think of themselves as a unified group, and they don't think of themselves as competing churches. They still try to work hard to kind of stay together. So to be a Talmud scholar, you have to develop a lot of skills. I developed a lot of skills. I grew up on the border between modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. So from the age of 6, I was going to prayers every day in synagogue with my father. I never missed a day. And I was competing in tournaments. Yes, there are tournaments where you memorize Mishnah. You memorize hundreds of Mishnahs and then you recite them. I was competing in these tournaments, and by the time I was 11, I had started studying Talmud, and it was an immersive experience. I was immersed in the language, and that's really an amazing way of learning how to learn this material, because by the time I was 14, 15, it was second nature to me. I could open up any passage of the Babylonian Talmud and read and understand, but it didn't really mean much to me. And then I went off to Israel after 11th grade. I finished high school early. I went off to Israel because that was commonly done in my schools. And the first day of yeshiva, I was sitting there and I was expected to study Talmud for the next 10 hours. And I just remember sitting there being, what am I going to do for the next 10 hours? Like, how am I going to make it through this? I didn't enjoy it at all. But 6 months later, I had a really amazing intellectual experience. I had a teacher who taught me the Talmud in this new and exciting way where all of a sudden, a lot of the things that hadn't made sense started to make sense. I would later learn that this was a historical way of thinking about the materials, but it really allowed me to see the continuation of interpretation from the Bible to the present. And I could really appreciate how the medieval scholars in the 12th and 13th century were really fantastic readers, juggling all kinds of interpretive challenges. And I could insert myself into their conversation, and it was a very spiritually nourishing thing. And suddenly I found myself studying Talmud for 16 hours a day and getting less sleep and doing things like staying up till 2 in the morning and I refer to this as my fundamentalist period because and if you've never had such a period, I want to tell you that there's something quite intoxicating about being fundamentalist. I don't think it's a great way of being in life, but I will tell you that I went through at least a 6-month period where I thought, what I am doing is the only truth out there, and it's really producing not only knowledge, but spirituality to the world, and I don't understand what everyone else in the world is doing. They're all wasting their time because I'm the one who has it, and I really just don't understand what everyone else is doing, and it's very intoxicating. The feeling was very intoxicating. It took several years to actually fully come down from this. I went off to college, and I committed to myself to study Talmud for 6 hours a day. And I did that while double majoring and finishing college in 3 years because I wanted to go to rabbinical school very quickly. I wanted to be back in a religious environment. It took me a long time before Now, when I was in rabbinical school, I got into big fights because I knew the truth. And my truth was a historical way of understanding the Talmud. But a lot of the people in my rabbinical school came to it with a very different way of thinking about this material. If you go to yeshivas, traditional yeshivas nowadays, if you go to Skokie or wherever the nearest yeshivas are, and you were able to understand what they're essentially doing is they're taking the Talmud and its commentarial tradition and they're treating it as a single conversation that they can take part in, and they're just trying to be spiritually nourished by any part of it that they find meaningful. A lot of it would not look to you like spiritual nourishment because a lot of it is discussions about oxes goring other oxes. But those are really conversations about how to be ethical and what your responsibilities are for other people. And when they start thinking about things through the legal lenses that have developed within the Jewish tradition for the last millennium, they're trying to get to a position of depth about understanding what kind of responsibilities we have to one another. But I got into lots of fights in rabbinical school because a lot of times they do historically unacceptable things. They're reading like later materials back into earlier materials, or they're prioritizing later interpretations over earlier interpretations, where I was trying to understand, well, what did the rabbis of the Talmud actually mean? And I couldn't have written this book when I was coming out of rabbinical school because I really still felt like I had the truth. And the other people who were doing something were kind of wasting their time. But I eventually went to a doctoral program in religious studies, and I studied with an academic who was a Holocaust survivor and one of the world's experts on Talmud. He's still active in his 90s. He lives in Israel now. He's writing a lifelong commentary on the Talmud. His name is David Weiss-Halivni. He has a fabulous memoir called The Book and the Sword about what the Talmud meant to him in Auschwitz. He has a photographic memory and he knows the entire Talmud by heart. I studied with him and he really nourished my historical side of things. And the more distance I got from it, the more I was able to see that actually there are a lot of different people in the world getting a lot of different things out of the Talmud. So in the book, I don't have much time to elaborate the framework of the book, but I'll just tell you in the book I came up with the 3 E's. There are 3 different Talmuds. There's the essential Talmud, there's the enhanced Talmud, and there's the emblematic Talmud. The essential Talmud is the Talmud that I was really looking for, which is trying to understand historically what the original Talmud produced by the rabbis in late antiquity meant at the time. It's what academics like myself really specialize in. We try to figure out historically what it meant. But the enhanced, one of the things I realized with distance was that the people like myself who, in the academic world are so obsessed with the essential Talmud that we kind of forget about the 1,000-year tradition of interpretation of the Talmud, and we ignore that tradition at our own peril, because that tradition is extremely rich with its own religious ideas. But we're so focused on getting the original meaning of the text that we don't take that material very seriously. We kind of like, oh, that's not interesting to us. Actually, most academics can't even read that material. I can because I came within a traditional context. But the other thing, so I now like create space for the essential and the enhanced. Now we all can do these different things and get different meanings from the Talmud. But I also created a third thing, the emblematic register, which I think you might be able to talk more about next week with the material that I gave you, and also if you look at my book, it might be helpful to understanding that. The emblematic register is, at some point I realized that there's a whole level of meaning that the Talmud has outside of all of these like insider fights about what the text means. So in the 13th century, and hopefully you'll talk about this next week, in the 13th century the Talmud gets put on trial by a Christian tribunal in France. And the Talmud is tried, it is indicted, and then it's put on trial, it's convicted, and then it's executed in a public burning that happens where the political executions take place. This is kind of a very, it's a very bizarre thing to treat a book as a person. But actually in my book I talk about how it's not so bizarre when you come at it from a medieval Christian way of thinking about the Eucharist and things like that. They're interesting. I actually think that the burning of the Talmud is like a passion story in reverse. It's a way of embodying Judaism in this book in a way that kind of makes sense because the Talmud is so important to Judaism. And so if you're going to pick a representative of Judaism, the Talmud kind of makes sense. But I don't want to spend, I know I only have a couple more minutes here. 8 minutes? I have 8 minutes?
You got about 2.
2 minutes. Okay. So I wanted to give you an example of something so the holiday of Yom Kippur is coming up. It's the Day of Atonement. It's the day on which Jews typically ask repentance. The Mishnah says that when you ask repentance, the way you ask repentance is you have to ask repentance in 2 ways. Because there are 2 types of sins. There are sins that are towards God, kind of ethical failings where they're kind of only God knows and only God cares. And then there are sins if you mistreat someone else. And Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is the day in which people are promised that God will forgive you. If you do the rituals, then God will forgive you. But God cannot forgive you, the Mishnah says, for things that you've done to another person. For those things, you have to ask forgiveness of the person that you have wronged. Now, of course, the Talmud then asks, how do we know this? And then what develops is a whole long conversation through multiple generations and different types of texts over the nature of repentance. So one of the things that comes out is you're supposed to ask repentance. You're supposed to ask people for repentance, and they're supposed to forgive you, but the tradition recognizes that they may not be able to forgive you. And so you're supposed to wait and ask them again. And you're supposed to ask them 3 times. And the person, if you ask them 3 times, they're supposed to forgive you. The text doesn't tell you what happens if they don't forgive you, but there are stories that are told. And then there are other stories that are told. And what's fascinating about the Talmud and its form is because of the interplay between Mishnah and its rules, and Midrash and its interpretations of the Bible, and then these other additional stories, the Talmud manages to present material in very complex ways. So there's precedent for having a range of views around an issue. So a story is told about a rabbi named Rav. Rav is the founder of the Babylonian post-Mishnah Academy. He is the founding rabbi who brings Rabbi Judah the Prince's Mishnah to Babylonia and starts the process of conversation around it. The story is told that Rav has a fight with the local butcher. And the local butcher somehow offends Rav. Rav thinks that the local butcher should be coming to him and asking for forgiveness. But it doesn't happen. So Rav thinks that he's going to do the local butcher a favor by going to the local butcher and presenting himself so that the person can ask him for forgiveness on the day before Yom Kippur. But he runs into one of his students, Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says, this is a bad idea. Don't go there. And Rav says, no, I'm going there to give him an opportunity to ask for forgiveness. And Rav Huna says, no, you're going there to kill him. Sure enough, Rav goes to the butcher store, and the butcher looks up. He's working on the meat, and the butcher looks up, and he sees Rav, and he says, I have nothing to say to you. and an accident happens, the knife hits the bone flies and gets lodged in the butcher's throat, and the butcher dies. Text ends there. Right? Right, so the Talmud has this amazing way of presenting materials. One of the things I point out in my book is that the Talmud has been reclaimed and reinterpreted in modernity beyond the essential and the enhanced. It has all kinds of meanings. So there's a French philosopher/theorist, Emmanuel Levinas, who is famous for producing a philosophy of the other. So if you want to talk about seeing things through the eyes of the other, Emmanuel Levinas is like the modern philosopher who's really, he basically creates the other for him is capitalized, it's capital O other, and basically it's the foundation of all ethics, and in a kind of post-theistic way, the other becomes God. He's kind of building off of Immanuel Kant and building off of an earlier Jewish philosopher named Hermann Cohen, who was interpreter of Kant, who are trying to move past. Kant has this notion that the only reason to be ethical is, the categorical imperative, doing something because you've come to the conclusion that it's in your best interests. It's kind of like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done to you, but it's kind of turned the other way. I want people to treat me well, so I'm treating other people well. And both Hermann Cohen and later Levinas, particularly after the Holocaust, feel like this is not an acceptable ethic, that ethics have to be more other-centered than self-centered. And so the basis for ethics has to be about the other. And so Levinas has a Talmudic reading where he goes and he reads this story of Rav and his encounter with the butcher. And the point, what he gets out of the story is, what's going on there is that Rav claims he's going because he's giving the man opportunity for forgiveness, but that's not really what's going on. What's going on is a kind of form of religious hypocrisy. He's using religious tools in a passive-aggressive way to take out his own hostility on the person. And if he was really honoring the sort of otherness, he would be prioritizing what the other needs over what he himself needs. And what his student recognizes and interrupts him and saying, you're not going to give him forgiveness, you're going to kill him. Because this act, which obviously in his own head was thought to be some kind of ethical act of giving the person an opportunity for atonement, was actually something in disguise. It wasn't giving an opportunity for atonement, it was actually giving an opportunity to hang himself. It was giving him news to hang himself because he was given the opportunity to destroy himself. I actually wrote an earlier book called Narrating the Law. That's really just for academics. But in my book, Narrating the Law, I do an academic version where I point out that the Talmud is actually full of stories like this one that have a bizarre relationship with legal realities. Because once you're done reading a story like this, it's like, okay, so should I give people opportunities for forgiveness, or shouldn't I give people opportunity? But the way the Talmud works, it's really beautiful because it gives a range, and so it gives you a different kind of pluralism within your spiritual practice where everyone is not the same. Everyone is going to be different. And anytime you have kind of a rule-based system where everyone has to act in a certain way, there's not a lot of space for subjective action. And so what I argued in Narrating the Law is the Talmud is modeling a different kind of narrative-based ethics where you're trying to recognize that my subjectivity is different than someone else's subjectivity. And so it's kind of related to how I feel like I've grown from my earlier fundamentalist stage to being able to create space. You want to be able to create space in your life for other people, regardless of where they're coming and what they're finding meaningful. And so I'll